Hello. Hello. Welcome to DDD. So, kick off today. I'd like to introduce you to Andrew. And Andrew's going to talk to you today. Andrew from Perth, I might add. He's going to talk to you today about UX design and VR and AR. So, without any further ado, here's Andrew. Thank you.
So can everyone, is that too loud? That's good? Okay. So I'm going to be trying to tease out the difference between the hype about VR and the reality of where it might go and what that means to a UX community. Now, I did a little bit of research. So the average age of people in this room is apparently 32 years old. Now, the question is, how long are you planning to be working? And according to these statistics, it'll be another half a century. So just imagine the kind of changes that are going to occur during your career. And that's really the kind of big perspective I want to bring to this talk. So to put for the purposes of presenting that context, a little trip back into history. So most of what we have was already being prototyped in the 1960s. And at the same time as that, there was this big explosion in science fiction. And a lot of that was about augmentation and how technology could enhance the experience of being human. And some of that was very negative, but a lot of it was very optimistic. And that's the dream of computer science, is that we can remember more, find out more things, communicate more quickly, that we can have new ways to create and have new experiences. So that's been the great dream, and a part of that was new ways to see. And what we're looking at here is a 1968 very early augmented reality system. Now, during the 1980s, that utopian idea became very, very strong in popular culture, and I'm sure you're all familiar with both of these intellectual properties, and they've had an enormous impact on our perception about how the future will be. And of course, people who like to work with computers are probably even more involved with this kind of pop culture than the average person. Yes, we're all nerds. We're all here in the room. We can say that. But what's very cool about it is that they are absolutely anticipating things. Up here in the top left, Doc Brown has got some augmented reality sunglasses. Might be the cheapest prop in the history of science fiction, but that's in the story what they do. And here's a virtual reality experience. And then, of course, there's a holodeck from Star Trek, which gave a view of virtual reality that was so futuristic that in point of fact it was dangerous. You could be killed in a virtual reality and so forth and so on. So this has really informed our idea about virtual reality, and it has become, this idea of the head-mounted display has become iconic of our progression through technology, iconic of technological advancement after the Second World War. And that's a problem. And so here we are. So this is much more recent. This is now. And yet we still have this incredible image of someone wearing a very high-tech head-mounted display or goggles or whatever you want to call it. And they're reaching forth into the future, always from right to left for some compositional graphic design reason. It's like a standard. And they're reaching out to the grid, the mesh, the cyberpunk, cyber future mesh. So it's very powerful. And this has existed for as long as probably all of us have been alive, and certainly has existed for all of the time that all of us have been professionals in this field. So, a trip back to when I didn't have grey hair. In fact, I used to have red hair. And so this is virtuality. Now, virtuality is famous in VR history. It was the first publicly available VR experience that was even in the ballpark of a working system. And I was walking through a video arcade in London in 1992. And so you can imagine my complete delight when I came across this. Now, this was my hoverboard moment. I thought, I have arrived in the future. So it was no problem for me to shell out the equivalent of $30 now to get into this. And so I'm going to, the appropriate way to describe the experience I had was that it was a shit experience. That's not official UX talk, but that's the experience I had. I had motion sickness. I didn't even understand what I was doing. There was a video game in there, and I have since, doing research, discovered that it was almost certainly Dactyl Nightmare. And it was named Dactyl Nightmare because it was a multiplayer first-person shooter in which there was also the added bonus of a pterodactyl who would sweep down, pick you up, and kill you. So I got through my $25 worth of being killed without even realizing that was what was happening. Because the image resolution you see here is on a monitor. That's not what you saw in the headset. So it was just a lot of very laggy, blurry pixels. And so I am an affirmed VR skeptic. So by 1995, Nintendo had demonstrated at enormous cost and embarrassment that VR was not going to happen in retail domestic game environments. Their worst ever selling console, although they're now worth quite a lot of money. So if you have one in the retro market, retro nostalgia market, they're big. So there's all of these problems with VR. These are the alleged reasons why we... Oh, going laser pointer, sorry about that. But most people say that the problem here is that there's an issue with the low resolution and the latency and the lack of good content. That people don't play the games or the experiences because the content's not compelling enough, which means there's no market, which means no one will spend the money to improve all of the issues with lag and latency. I don't believe that. If you do a first principles UX analysis of what's going on here with VR, that argument doesn't stand up, and I'm hoping to convince you about that today. Now, what has happened since I was a broken young man in a gaming arcade in London is all of this shit's happened. Now, this we are very, very familiar with. This is the world we live in. This has changed our reality. It's changed everything about the way we live. All of those products and experiences have happened. Now, this is science fiction. This is stuff that we did not imagine would be happening only 30 years ago. It was in science fiction, but we didn't think it would actually happen to us. Now, we've been doing this for so long, it's almost become a cliche to talk about it. Now, VR has the fundamental characteristic that excludes the real world to allow immersion. But actually, we do that all of the time anyway. When you listen to music or read a book or are on the phone talking to someone or are just having a flight of imagination, you are creating immersion, which doesn't have to come with the enormous burden of the hardware. And AR has the fundamental characteristic that it overlays layers. And we're doing that all of the time, and all of the digital media we're already working with already does that as well. So where I'm getting to with this is that the fundamental problem with VR is that it doesn't value add. You know, head-mounted displays do not make for a better experience in any way. And that's why people don't want them, not because of low resolution. Okay, so we're moving on to the current VR boom, and we're still here with this iconic thing. But to demonstrate very compellingly, I hope, that nobody wants VR, it's not a value-add proposition, is the experience of Sony. Now, Sony have produced a PlayStation gaming system since the 1990s. The current version is the PlayStation 4. They've sold 100 million units. 3 years after they launched that, they started selling. So this was a $400 PlayStation, and then 3 years ago they started selling the $400 VR extension. Now, 4 million units would make most people happy, but I can assure you that Sony will not be impressed with only 4% of people who bought a PlayStation taking up the VR headset. I'm prepared to bet that most of those VR headsets are now in the same box as all of the unused mobile phones that we've all got at home, and all the spare internet connection cables. It hasn't taken off. And if Sony can't do it with that installed base, it's not a real thing. To me, that was the test point. Okay, but what has happened is this gigantic event, which is that Facebook went bonkers and spent $3 billion buying out a small startup company who had sold almost no product and didn't even believe the thing they were selling was yet a finished product. Now, does that mean that the VR, the domestic home retail VR entertainment market is a real thing that's going to happen? Well, no, because organizations like Facebook have got more money than God, and they've got to do something with it. Now, this is happening to us. It's our fault because we watched all of those ads, which all of this money was earned from, on all of that social media. That's why they've got this money. But what's happening here is that organizations that size have got to do something to own the future market. Facebook's under enormous pressure from other competitors, now facing possible government control. And so they and that long list of other people who are moving into it are now in a titanic war to own what may be the future. I'm just going to go back here. Now, the other thing is that most of those organizations are big enough to put this money into VR for a very simple reason. They can afford to lose it, but whatever comes out of this, they will have developed an enormous number of new IPs, technology and software, which they will then utilize in future. So for them, it's a great big gamble stroke experiment, which will probably work out. They're not going to go bust out of this. And that means that all of those technical problems with VR headsets and AR headsets will be solved. There won't be any more problems. Thank you, Derek. Okay. So, what does that mean to us in the UX business? Well, the people who are going to have the money to pay for these incredibly high-tech headsets and so forth and so on are not individuals, it's corporations. It's the same market we're already working with. People, organizations who can afford, who've got perfectly good economic rationale for why they need to solve these problems. So the value add that head-mounted displays, whether it's VR or AR, offer, to me, is not higher resolution, it's that it's hands-free. And that's critically important in a whole range of very important industries, where you, for safety reasons and mobility reasons, and because people are doing stuff with their hands. That's the real value add. Now, the really interesting thing about this area here is that hands-free is going to dramatically and radically change the way UIs have to be. This is not going to be the hamburger icon in the top right-hand screen in your vision. These are cognitively demanding environments. So these are going to have to be voice, but voice won't work if you're in a noisy environment. Gesture, but that won't work if you're going to use your hands. Possibly face movements, possibly eye tracking, and then excitingly and scarily at the same time, brain-computer interfaces. Now, I did some research about this other weird, scary, dystopian science fiction thing, and I regret to tell you, it is a thing. It is really happening. It's come out of research about how to repair damaged nerves. And so basically this is going to be either like heart monitor pads on you. Now, what's going to make that possible for your thoughts about simple directioning and selection is AI. So AI is going to be able to filter out of the noise of your body that kind of information. And then the other big value add that's going to make these headsets very interesting to industry is AI more generally. So it's going to be able to do all of those things, and that's going to make for a very, very powerful combination. So what I'm basically saying here is that in the entertainment world, in the domestic, particularly the domestic and games area, people are not going to be watching TV with head-mounted displays. It doesn't value add. And that's probably good for us because it means our traditional clients are going to be employing us to do this stuff. So I'm just going to run through very quickly through how I imagine this is a kind of scenario. So I've chosen what it's like to be an ambulance crew. You're first responding to some awful incident, and let's just say it's a car crash. This is obviously highly cognitively difficult, and what's different for ambulance and paramedics is that they're turning up to a real-world location completely outside the controlled space of a hospital. They never know what they're going to find. So this is exactly the kind of environment where you would love it if you had some kind of head-mounted display that allowed you to work with your hands, and it was assisting you without getting in your face. So there is no interface visually, but it's checking, it's identifying things in the object, identifying hazards, and communicating information. Like, for example, you arrive at an accident and you find the ID of the person, or even face recognize them. This happens automatically. And you simply show the driver's license for a moment in your field of view, knowing that the AI has already worked out who that person is and is currently calling up their medical records to find out what they're allergic to, or what pre-existing conditions they have. You're making your assessment, and you merely need to speak that assessment, and that assessment is now being transmitted to the nearest hospital where this patient will be transported once they're stabilized, buying more time, making that hospital more ready. But additionally, what these systems would do, they would allow the user, the other person at risk, to be assessed for stress, and so forth and so on. Okay, so we're at the end of this talk now. So basically, the challenges facing us are those things. A lot of this hardware is still in its very early stages, but it is definitely coming. The amount of money that's being thrown at this means it will happen. And the question that you've now got to ask yourself, apart from how long are you going to be in this business, is what are you going to do when your client comes back from a meeting with someone else who's been talking about this stuff, and they say, "Can you do that?" Thank you very much.